I was in conferences the whole of this month. It's basically conference season here in Mexico City. As soon as the tourists leave, I mean, the tourists never leave, but as soon as most of the waves of tourists leave, you get the waves of corporates who come in. And so there was like the Milken conference, and I spoke at that. There was the book fair in the Zócalo, which was incredible, and I spoke at that. And what else? I was in a lot of things. It was a very, very productive October, just in time for me to go to the book fair and say, my book's not out yet, but it'll be out when this is all over.
I mean, you gotta start selling before. That's just the way.
That's what I thought. Yeah. But this is probably the reason why there's no investment in Mexico, which is the topic of today's podcast, because of all these terrible mismatches of events and things that you want to sell.
But I mean, to me, the question first is there no investment? Again, I hate to be a contrarian, but I always have this thing where I hear a lot of things are terrible, nothing's working, it's falling apart. But I've been hearing it since I was born. Do the numbers actually reflect that?
That's exactly the point. Since we were literally born, I think the big issue has been a lack of investment. I'll be talking about why that actually is, why it's exactly when we were born that matters, but we'll get to that in a sec. But just to answer your broader question, yes, the answer is basically you can have it both ways because investment has been pretty middling the whole time. There's a wonderful graphic that I saw recently, which is how much have the great economies of the world grown over the past 25 years in the 21st century. And China, it's like 1,500%. And right at the bottom of the list is Mexico with 83%. So almost doubled its economy in 25 years. But when you take into account the standards of living that everyone else has experienced, the growth, when you take into account population growth, all that, that's when you start realizing growth isn't growth if it's not enough. And what drives economic growth, ultimately? It's investment. Sure, you can do redistribution, which is what we've been experiencing over the past few years, and that's been very good because Mexico has sometimes had lots of growth, economic growth, without anyone feeling it because it gets pocketed by the big companies. Now we've got kind of the opposite, which is low growth. It's not negative yet, but, low growth, but it's been sort of redistributed far more equitably, so people feel happier for the first time in a long time.
Of course, the big concern there is that can only go on for so long before the people who'd been driving the growth for the longest time say, well, I've had enough, I'm leaving. Or at least I'm not going to continue to invest in this particular region of the world.
And this isn't you being a classic right-wing liberal. This is something that even the Morena party, at least those who understand economics, are saying. To me, the red flag really went off when I read an opinion column by Gerardo Esquivel. He's the former sub-governor of the Bank of Mexico, very respected left-wing economist, very much on the Morena, López Obrador, Claudia Sheinbaum side of things. He's campaigned with them openly. And the title of his piece a few weeks ago was, please don't scare off investment. And we'll get off to why these investors are scared nowadays. But I think this is kind of my pet peeve with investors in and around Mexico, which is why have we not had investment over the past 30-something years, like a sizable investment compared to India, Brazil, China, the United States, other comparable economies? A lot of it comes down to fear. And a lot of it is because there is always a friggin' excuse. There's always suspicion that Mexico is about to take a turn for the worse. I mean, recently, just in recent years, there has been a complete flatlining of investment. And a lot of people nowadays like to blame the government, but actually the flatline has been going on for far longer than the sort of underperformance has been going on far longer than the left-wing government. But since the left-wing government has been around, we've had Trump won, so people didn't invest. We've had the election of López Obrador in 2018, which means people were scared of a left-wing government, so they didn't invest. Then we had COVID, so people didn't invest. Then we had Claudia Sheinbaum being elected with a supermajority with Morena, so people didn't invest. And then you had Trump too, so people didn't invest. And now we've got the upcoming USMCA review, which is the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and people aren't investing because, uncertainty. So there's always an excuse.
Yes. Just to be clear, I mean, there is investment and it's sizable. We're talking tens of billions of dollars in foreign direct investment, but it should be a lot more for an economy of the size of Mexico. And that also an economy that has so many untapped opportunities.
Just to quote an investor, like a Miami-based investor that I spoke to at the Milken conference here in Mexico City. Like the Milken conference is just a big investors conference around the world. It's got a sort of big event yearly in LA, but they come to Mexico City to promote like investment in Mexico. And there was a Miami-based investor who said, I've never seen a country like Mexico with its economic fundamentals being so strong with so little investment. Like that weird disjunction is really strange to me, he said.
I think one of the problems there is and I've always had this issue. I think we talked about this when we did the podcast on the Mexican Central Bank, where yes, the fundamental, like we said that the fundamentals in Mexico are very strong. Public debt is never completely out of control. At least it hasn't been for decades. Inflation is under control. In general, the government behaves properly, and there's all these other fundamentals around demographics, around natural resources, etc. Yes, but that's sort of the minimum, right? And that's what I'm always upset by. You can't say, "Oh, we're so great because we have the bare minimum." There's a lot of bigger structural elements that Mexico has never addressed that are behind long-standing lack of big investment. And one of the big ones, and Morena's tried to tackle it, and we've talked about it as well, repeatedly, maybe not in the right way, but they've tried to tackle it, is everything to do with the justice system. So a lot of people don't want to invest in Mexico because if something goes wrong, like someone robs you, for example, someone doesn't want to pay you back, you cannot be certain that the justice system is going to do anything about it. What's more, you can be fairly certain that they're not going to do anything about it. So that's also a big structural problem that is a reality that hinders a lot of investment.
And sadly, the scale seems to be tipping towards it's getting worse when it comes to the justice system. There's a lot of debate, right? People broadly like the judicial reform that Mexico implemented a few months ago. Morena and President Sheinbaum has a supermajority. They democratically can and have changed the judicial system. The issue is, of course, when we're talking about investment, we're actually not talking about democracy. We're talking about this very authoritarian world of rich people and companies who want to or don't want to invest in a country, and they very much dislike the reform. Why? I mean, it's relatively understandable because the government has not assuaged their worries about this, which is because all judges from the very top Supreme Court to the very smallest magistrate locally are elected by the people now. It's not so much that people are worried that democracy is bad. I think it's the fact that because people don't understand what they're voting for, we went through the process. I followed it closely. If you want a sort of chronicle of how that worked out, I'll put it in the show notes. But basically, it was a very opaque system with a very good electoral authority, which I sort of applaud throughout the process, the INE. I think they did their job really well in very, very little time with very little money. Yet what we ultimately got was people being shepherded to vote for the right candidates. That's a very big quote unquote there around right. And so what you actually got was people who were aligned with the government. Now, that could be great if you're a business person aligned with the Mexican government, but a lot of them aren't. And so why would you invest in a country where you think that the judges are not going to be impartial and that they might not apply, say, contract law to your advantage? I'd get loads and loads and loads of pushback from Morena for saying that. And I think there are lots of good judges, but this is what I'm telling you here is the fear that people have. It may not actually end up being the reality, but the fear is all these judges seem to be very close to Morena. And if you ever got into a fight with the government, which, the government hasn't been paying a lot of their suppliers, for example, Pemex specifically, the oil company, maybe if you take them to court, you actually won't get the result you legally should get.
And it's not just that. Let's say that actually nothing is worse than it used to be. Let's say that, these judges won't vote and won't, act openly in favor of Morena. It'll just continue to be the same way as it used to be. The way it used to be was useless. The way it used to be didn't work. So, if you carry out this massive reform and the reform is going to lead to the same thing or potentially worse, of course investors aren't going to like it. The only thing that tells you that kind of reform tells you when you finally have a supermajority, which hadn't existed in the country since 1997? is that we're not heading in the right direction.
And this isn't us being, let's let big business roll over everyone. Actually, big business is fine with this because they've got direct contact with the president. And also, they have got something that most medium and small businesses don't have, which is arbitrage. You can actually, if you're rich enough, completely skip over the legal system in a country and just do private justice. So you pay for an arbiter and you sign a contract with your suppliers and whatever, and you say any problem we have, we'll legally deal with privately on the side beyond the judicial system. So actually what worries me is the small and medium businesses, and this is where investment is important because investment and borrowing, I guess, is the two things. Something that really jumped out to me, and this will lead into your favorite topic, which is López Portillo. One of the things that really jumped out to me was a graphic in a newspaper the other day, Reforma, which showed the amount of lending commercial banks do as a percentage of GDP. And not only is Brazil ahead of us, but so is Colombia, so is Guatemala. It's insane. Mexico is incredibly low. Mexico's way ahead in 1994. And Mexico has never got back to those levels. Do you remember? I mean, you were quite young, but do you remember what happened in 1994?
I don't remember what happened. I know what happened. I just don't remember it happening. It was an extraordinary crisis, the last great financial crisis that Mexico has faced, famously called the tequila crisis, right? But I think, as you said, the backdrop to all of that is our good old friend López Portillo, the OG López. Before Andrés Manuel López Obrador was everyone's fear, it was López Portillo. And the story with López Portillo is relevant because when we look at the history of investment in Mexico, let's forget ancient history and just focus on the 20th century. After the revolution, the country gets into a nice sort of rhythm, like a let's picture a dance floor where you basically have society, government, and business, and they all have to be in sync, right? And from the 40s till the 70s, some issues in between, but for the most part, that dance floor looked like a Viennese ballroom. It was just waltz on waltz and people twirling, and everyone was better off. Government was happy, businesses were making tons of money, and industry was being formed, and society was doing well. But by 1982, López Portillo manages to completely just ruins the party for everyone.
Becomes a mosh pit.
Exactly. Everyone gets trampled. It's just a disaster. And specifically what he does, in addition to a bunch of other mistakes, but the really colossal one is that he decides to confiscate, on behalf of the state, all private banking, right? It's the nationalization, but it's not really the right term because it was already national. It was owned by Mexicans, but it's taken by the state. The statization, let's say, of all banking. And after that is such a betrayal from the government to the business people of Mexico who had been in cahoots for the longest time. And I feel that the country never really recovers from that. These are wounds that never really healed. And a lot of the big old money, which controls an extraordinary amount of the Mexican economy, still hasn't gotten over that. And part of the reason is that the government hasn't been very good at recreating that relationship in such a way that you can have real trust from presidential term to presidential term. What you've had since the 1980s to date is sort of every time you get a new president, the music slows down and you're waiting to see what's going to happen. Is it going to be a waltz? Is it going to be rock? Is it going to be a mosh pit? We don't know. And you're always sort of second guessing every presidential term. And the music in the past few years we haven't really hit the right rhythm, let's say.
I can't underscore this enough, dear listeners, that the thing that Tavo was saying, there's a reason why the Mexico Political Economist was born with an article about how Carlos Slim does politics, because really he's one of the last great political business people. He's not in electoral politics, but he knows how to play the Mexican political game to a T. He's always talking to presidents, no matter what stripe or political ideology they're aligned with. And I think you're absolutely right, Tavo. 1982 really represents a schism between the moneyed classes and the political classes. And what's interesting is, even when you do get liberal governments later on, what you start getting as trust starts to build back is a loss in power. And this is what's interesting, because it's the uncertainty and fear is always fed by one of two things. The fear currently is being fed by something similar to what the fear was in 1982, which is this government is overpowered and imposing their statist vision onto us. So we're not going to invest, we're going to take our capital out of the country, etc., as business people, say the business people. But sometimes, you get governments that are very pro-business, which is what we got from 1988 until, I'd say, maybe like the middle of the 2010s. And what's interesting is, well, why didn't they invest back then? The answer is they did, but also they didn't as much as they probably should have. And that's because there's the other factor, the other fear factor, which is a lack of trust in the government's ability to do things. So sometimes you're too scared of the government because it's overpowered and against you. Feels like that's what the business community feels. But then on the other side, sometimes you think, great, the government's here for me. Vicente Fox, right? Vicente Fox, elected from 2000 to 2006, he literally said, I'm going to make a government of business people for the business people. Literally his words. This isn't even something that was put in his mouth. And yet he had no majority. His party was always number 2 in the Senate and the Congress. He had no power to do anything. And so, again, right, it comes down to that uncertainty. Sometimes it's uncertainty through fear. What's this left-wing government going to do to my business? And sometimes it's uncertainty through impotence. Oh my God, this right-wing government has really great intentions and is completely useless. And
this actually takes us to a particular characteristic of investment in Mexico, which is oftentimes investment in Mexico does occur. And that includes foreign investment. But what doesn't grow sufficiently is foreign direct investment. I remember when I was in the Mexican Central Bank, hearing my bosses use the words puro papelito, only little papers. Because their concern was, if you look at investment in Mexico for decades, the bulk of investment focuses on portfolio investments. You're investing essentially in paper. You're not actually committing to staying in the country. You're not buying. They also said it always in the Mexican Central Bank was, no están comprando fierros. They're not buying chunks of steel. They're buying paper. They're buying short-term commitments. And the problem with short-term commitments is you can always run away. Right? And there's two sides to this, right? Because you can always run away with that money whenever you see things not working out, it's difficult to actually put that money to work in a really productive way, number one. Number two, the reason these investments are only short-term paper as opposed to actually buying factories and so on is what you're saying, is this massive uncertainty. And that uncertainty takes us all the way back to what we're saying about these structural elements in the country that simply haven't been addressed. Even with supermajorities, there's a failure to address them properly.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of an accident of history that most right-wing liberal or pro-business governments, or like openly pro-business governments, have tended to be weak governments when it comes to the politics, and the strong governments tend to be more, I don't want to call them anti-business, because I don't think people would call Claudia Sheinbaum anti-business. I think a lot of business people have come out with a lot of support for her, but they're scared of the party, and they're scared of some of the more radical elements within them. What's fun to think about, or sort of what's the opposite of fun, what's incredibly sad to think about, is the fact that when people do invest, they do incredibly well. I mean, BBVA, the Spanish bank that came to Mexico in the aftermath of that nationalization, bought up a Mexican bank and sort of set up shop here, has made its billions in Mexico. It subsidizes its Spanish operations with Mexican profits. And that's the interesting thing, right? Like, a lot of the Mexican dream was built on the fact that Mexico was going to be tethered to the US, and therefore we were going to export loads to the US and to the world, and we were going to get rich that way. But what's funny is the current government and also lots of companies have realized the Mexican domestic market, if it has enough money, actually is a really profitable market to exist in. That's why Walmex, which is like the Mexican subsidiary of Walmart, is the third biggest company in the country. That's why BBVA does so well in the country. And that's why so many countries that focus and invest on the domestic market do really well. What's interesting is they do so well that they start doing something that has been criticized lately, which is they reinvest their profits. So that's investment, right? But it's bad investment, according to the critics, because it's companies making profits and reinvesting them. It's no fresh investment. I mean, I think the truth is you want fresh investment because that's what really drives the economy, because you also want the fresh investment plus the reinvestment. So far, we've only, quote unquote, got the reinvestment. What does that tell us? Number one, that these companies are very invested in the country. Number two, it's not worth taking the money out because you want to expand your business here. And number three, it means that it sort of keeps us on the, I guess, on this flat line rather than falling. So we're not receiving new investments, but we're not in free fall because people aren't taking their profits out once they have invested.
Yeah, so things are working in Mexico, right? And you have, I think the simile here can be made with, or the comparison can be made with innovation. Like reinvesting is a little bit like incremental innovation. Yes, you are making, new things. Let's say there are changes. That's great. But the really cutting edge stuff isn't incremental innovation. It's all out innovation, and all out growth doesn't come from just reinvestment. It comes from big, new direct investments that have big, bold projects, right? And that's what's not happening in Mexico. Now, the thing is, we're living a bit of a change in the times. This is a global thing, of course, but Mexico is really living it for a variety of reasons. But I think the BBVA, the Bancomer example is a wonderful example to use in order to speak about this. Is BBVA became incredibly profitable, has been incredibly profitable for that banking group since they purchased Bancomer back in the 90s. But that's not because they do a particularly good job as a bank. The bulk of those extraordinary profits by global standards that they have doesn't come from commercial banking, despite them being a commercial bank. The bulk of those profits come from fees, which is just pure rent extraction. So when the banking system was reprivatized in the 1990s, the idea was that those banks the private sector would do a better job of running these banks for the purpose that banks were made in the first place, which is lending money, right? But the problem is, it's been a wonderful story of how privatization has led to business growth. That's wonderful, but it hasn't led to the growth of the thing that they were built for in the first place, which is fomenting investment and fomenting growth. And I think this is the crux of the matter, right? Well, banks in Mexico have been facing increasing pressure from the government saying, you have to stop charging these outrageous fees. We're going to put a ceiling on them. You have to do your actual job, right? You need to lend money. Cool. Then the banks, of course, say, all right, fine, we'll consider doing that. But you need to change, you need to make these reforms so that I can feel, trust in actually lending out money, because I believe that you're going to back me when people don't pay me back. But then you get these ridiculous reforms, or the ridiculous implementation of reforms that don't actually address the problem. So it's this massive loop, and you can't expect. Of course, you need to demand of companies to stop just doing pure rent extraction. Right, that's fair. But you also then need to do your part as a government and say, I promise to actually follow through on creating the circumstances that allow you to make money in a fair way.
And that's where we get to the crux of this whole issue, right? We've been channeling a lot of the complaints big business has because they're the ones who have to do the investment ultimately. Mexico is traumatized in lots of different ways when it comes to government intervention and the role of the state and the market in economic life. For that reason, Claudia Sheinbaum, even though Mexico has a relatively low deficit compared to lots of other similar countries, it actually wants to lower it. So we've got a left-wing government that wants to cut and spend as opposed to tax and spend. So it doesn't want to put up taxes, but it wants to spend on its people. And so it's gone for an interesting avenue, which is the avenue of saying, don't worry, we're not going to charge you any new taxes, but guess what? Business has been very naughty over the past decades. And not only have they been extracting rent from people for no real gain, like things as ridiculous as to get your own money out of a cash point, they will charge you the equivalent of a third of a day's wages. Not a joke. Literally a third of a day's wages back when they were lower minimum wages. That's what you had to pay to get your money out of a different cash point, which is a free service in anywhere else in the UK, in the US, etc. And so they say, in the same way you've been doing that, we've also noticed that you haven't been paying all of your taxes. And so we open up a new front in this sort of government versus business, like confrontation. The government says we're not going to put the deficit up. We're going to be responsible. That means we can't spend as much as you'd like on infrastructure and other investments, which tend to be the vanguard that induces the rest of companies to come in and invest. The government's investing, so now we feel safe. And so they say we need a bit more money to cut the deficit, be responsible, and we're going to get it through the back taxes that you owe us, the billions and billions of dollars that you owe us. And here's where we get this weird little struggle between, and when I say little, I mean titanic, between the Mexican state, the tax authority, which is called the SAT here, SAT, and Mexican businesses and, multinational businesses based in Mexico. The businesses say they're undergoing fiscal terrorism, which is a wonderfully hyperbolic term, which makes you think this stinks of propaganda. And
it's my new favorite term. It's my new favorite term. The degree to which it's just used nonstop is also my favorite thing.
And what it means is companies have to pay their taxes, the ones that they owe. The thing is, of course, companies say, but we don't owe these taxes. They're charging us more. They're sort of making up back taxes as they go. The thing is, they do actually owe, like as soon as they say that, the government unveils another sort of cesspool of tax avoidance in a really immoral way, because obviously that's what lawyers are for. It's to avoid taxes in the most legal way possible, if not ethical. And so we've got this weird vicious circle, as Tavo mentioned, which is the vicious circle in which no one wants to invest because no one trusts the government, and the government doesn't trust business because they feel they're cheating, like the government. And so it's that weird vicious circle. And the horrible thing is they're both right about each other. They're both as bad as each other thinks.
There's one small thing that I would add here about specifically on the specifics of the fiscal terrorism, which is there's this, do we owe you the money? Do we not owe you the money that's going on between companies and the government? We can have a debate on, some of it is they actually do owe, some, who knows, some it's, it happened too long ago for them to be charging that money now. Whatever the case, one of the things that the government is doing, which is very naughty, is to withhold the VAT that they need to give companies back, and as well as other taxes they need to give them back, which is a substantial amount of money sometimes. So there are some very large groups in Mexico, industrial groups. There was one which at some point in the AMLO administration was owed by the government $250 million. This is the kind of money that you depend on as working capital. $250 million is a lot of money. It doesn't matter how big of a group you are. So if you were holding this money, which is legally yours, under the idea of, well, I'll give it to you when you give me what I say you owe me, which we didn't agree on and we still haven't agreed on, you can make companies basically go out of business, which does sound a little bit like, I don't know if terrorism, but it's pretty bad.
And then on the flip side, you've got the government, which suddenly finds out that the banks have been writing off VAT on a deposit they're supposed to make on the bailout fund that was initially created and paid for by the Mexican taxpayer in 1994 when the banking system collapsed because of the banks. They were saved with taxpayer money, and now it turns out that sure, they're depositing a little bit of it, but they're paying fewer taxes because of it. They're writing off other taxes on the basis of that. So that loophole was closed, but it really does away with your good faith. I don't think, there's no indication that it was illegal, but it was definitely one of those things where you think, oh, this is some terrible legalese that was never meant to be there, and it's definitely not the spirit of what the thing that was created here. So again, right, like, I really don't want to be on anyone's side. I'm not putting my hands into the fire for anyone here, because I do believe that the government is overreaching sometimes with some industries, and then sometimes some industries are overreaching themselves. Let me tell you a little story that has happened literally over the course of the past few weeks, which illustrates this insane, vicious cycle perfectly, even when the feeling, the mutual feeling between the parts is really good. This is the story of Carlos Slim's oil empire working with Pemex, which is the world's most indebted oil company. They've worked together to sort of save Mexico's oil industry together, private and public sector working together. Hooray, right? So they sign some massive contracts, and then a few weeks later, you get the SAT, the tax authority, coming in and embargoing some of the Carlos Slim oil rigs or, drilling material because he hasn't paid his taxes. And then a few weeks later, Pemex comes back to a different part of the company and says, oh, by the way, I can't pay you because I'm really indebted for the services you've already provided. So nobody's playing fair here, but everyone feels like they're the victim because nobody's paying what they're supposed to be paying to each other.
There's another story which I'd like to bring up here, which I think talks about how this is not a new thing. You mentioned this already. It's not a new thing that the government and the ultra-rich are at odds with each other when it comes to taxes. Now, you've written most recently in the Mexico Political Economist about Salinas Pliego's ever-increasingly sort of theatrical shows or spectacles against the government. But there was an instance, I can't remember exactly if this was right before Enrique Peña Nieto was elected in 2012 or right after. But around that time, Ricardo Salinas Pliego owes a bunch of money to the Mexican government. And the SAT sends a person to demand that he give that money. And the way that's done is that he needs to deliver a letter to a specific address, right? The very, sort of the American, you've been served kind of thing. Well, a member of the government he shows up to, address 185 on whatever street. But when he gets there, address 185 is no longer address 185. It says outside it reads 187. So when he goes to deliver the thing, they say, oh, you've got the wrong address. But of course, they changed the number on the building that morning so that the guy couldn't deliver the thing. When the guy says, I don't care, you're going to receive this because, I have the maps here of, which building is which and yours is this one. Salinas Pliego had his bodyguards beat this government official up. And then eventually everything got, resolved because
and he's like a delivery boy. He's not like
exactly like he's.
Yeah, there's no Schadenfreude here. Like he's not like some fancy bureaucrat. He's some poor delivery boy.
Exactly. But the guy luckily was able to call in the police, and the police came in and stopped the bodyguards, and they were arrested and whatnot. And the order was ultimately served. But Salinas Pliego got away with this for a while, and he never answered for that crime, which obviously these bodyguards were acting on his orders.
We need to do a full Salinas Pliego podcast because he is such a character. He is both, on one side, probably the most potent political figure from the opposition to date, and at the same time, one of the most vulnerable people from the business community when it comes to this fiscal terrorism / economic fiscal justice battle that is going on. Just to give you a bit of context, there was this wonderful birthday party that he had over the weekend, which felt more like a political rally. And the sort of climax was him saying, I want to pay my taxes. The government just won't let me. Sort of very, very moving. I shed a manly tear. But what was crucial was he says, I've done the calculations myself, and I'm willing to pay within the next 10 days 7.6 billion pesos in taxes that I owe. That's about 10% of what he actually owes. The thing is, he owes 10 times that, and he's sort of pretending to be sort of like grandiose about it. The problem is, of course, I don't think he can afford. He doesn't have the liquidity to pay 76 billion pesos. And he's in trouble in the US. And so I think it's one of those things where the political economy is very much the political economy, because he's not only going to be pushed towards fighting the government even more. The day that he can't fight anymore through the courts or through the public sphere might be the day he moves into electoral politics. And he'd be very good at it.
But also terrifying, given his antics with having government officials beat up because they deliver a letter he doesn't like.
Yes,
but there is something that I think is important to mention, which is we talk a lot about. Well, we talk in this podcast a lot about people like Carlos Slim, like Ricardo Salinas Pliego, these big tycoons, these big billionaires, and that's not just because they have some fantastic stories behind them. That's because the degree of power and influence that they hold in Mexico is relatively unique. Not entirely unique. Something similar happens in Brazil or in India, but the same level of power and influence is not seen in places like in the UK or in the US. Of course, Jeff Bezos, of course, Lord Alan Sugar are very powerful people in the respective countries. But if Jeff Bezos or Lord Alan Sugar throw a big tantrum, the economy moves on. But the likes of Salinas Pliego or Slim throw a big tantrum in Mexico, that can actually slow things down. One, because they're very good at theatrics, but two, it's linked to the way in which the Mexican economy was built. Very corporativist, everyone sort of had their role, and private players were given an enormous role. And these big names like Salinas Pliego, like Slim, have control over over the majority of the key industries in the country. So if they throw a tantrum, they can stop the country. And there's an additional element, which is obviously not all industry is controlled by billionaires in Mexico. There is a middle class and there is a lower gentry, let's say. But Mexico is such a class-conscious country that a lot of these upper middle class and lower upper class, let's say, people who have money and who can, get the economy going, tend to spend a lot of their money on sort of showing that they belong to a particular class. So they're not very helpful to actually... Los fresas, exactly. They're not super helpful at actually driving investment. So you end up depending on these mega billionaires who do have the extra cash to make these massive investments.
It's a sad thing, right? What's, again, one of these other vicious cycles is the fact that the government and some business people are in a weird tension right now, which means they sort of hold a bit of leverage, the business people, because they don't invest. Most investment, sort of knee-jerk, likewise, goes to the US, that they make billions and then they send their money to the US stock exchange, which isn't a Mexico-specific thing, right? Like the US stock exchange holds the largest percentage of money of any stock exchange than ever has before. And so it's not a uniquely Mexican thing, but it's just Mexican business putting their money away for it to grow elsewhere. And yet the Mexican government, run by a nationalist party, nationalist left-wing party, is particularly useless at speaking to outside investors. They just don't bother, which is crazy to me. Now, Tavo and I have, of course, been focusing on the most extreme cases. Actually, the sad truth is that this isn't as dramatic as it seems on the surface. Ultimately, what all this tug of war means is that everything's sort of at a standstill. It means that the Mexican economy is sort of moving along by its own momentum. Reinvestment, all that, no new investment. So actually, what we've got is business people who want to invest but don't know when. Government that would love business people to invest and is trying to sort of, beyond the sort of tax drama we've been talking about, is actually trying to have a conversation with them. And then a sort of international investment class that is waiting on either the government or the local business people to make the first move, but waiting for that to happen first. And so everyone's on this weird standby pattern. And as time ticks on, Mexico loses its window of opportunity for investment because it's in its best moment right now, many people would argue. Now, there's something we could do, or at least I'm giving myself that power in this podcast at least, which is there's something we could do from our sort of like analytical journalistic perspective, which is something we launched recently called the Plan Mexico Project, which is a Mexico political economist project that is a sort of spin-off within our usual coverage. And what the Plan Mexico Project is a sort of like Shark Tank / Dragon's Den for Mexico's priority sectors. For those who don't know, the Plan Mexico is Claudia Sheinbaum's ambitious yet incredibly vague industrial policy. It's the first proper industrial policy for decades, some would say. And what's interesting is it's actually quite clever. It's identified a bunch of sectors and it's trying to see how it can boost them, like strategic sectors. What's funny is she also wants to play nice with business. And so it turns out everyone's a winner. She's got to politically play this game where there's space for everyone in this industrial policy. But of course, industrial policy is ultimately picking winners and losers. The Mexican government and investors generally don't have infinite money to plug into an infinite number of sectors or things. And so what the Plan Mexico project is going to be a year-long project where we're going to analyze each of these sectors, sort of pit them against each other, see which ones are the most cost efficient, which ones promise the largest return on investments, which ones are going to properly develop Mexico rather than financialize and extract rent, and which ones are going to create jobs and make Mexico the economic power that it wants to be. If you are in any of these sectors and are listening to this, please do reach out, not for me, but for you, because you're competing with all the other sectors who already are reaching out to us. So do reach out. It's going to be a sprawling conversation over the course of many, many months. The most promising sectors will sort of dive in and see the sub-sectors and see actually where a few $1 million would make all the difference to trigger growth in this thing. Because it brings me back to what the CEO of Barclays said at the conference I was at just a week ago, which was Mexico ultimately just needs 2 or 3 big wins for everyone to see, oh, okay, this works. Mexico is now a viable option for me, and then we can open the floodgates. So the Mexico Political Economist is doing its part in this whole process.
I do have to ask, Alex, are you vying for the Minister of the Economy post that will open up in a few years?
Absolutely not, because that would deprive me of all the power that I've got right now, which is being able to speak truthfully. The terrible, terrible, sad thing about being a politician is that you're not allowed to say anything. It's heartbreaking to see them squirm.
You just have to say everything is great and it's going to be even better, but it can't be better because it's already perfect, but it'll be better.
Exactly. And the business people, by the way, have to say the same thing because, they want Mexico to do well. That's something we keep going back to. They invest their money abroad. Some of them do move away, but ultimately Mexican patriotism is a thing to behold. And it's fascinating how people would rather die on the hill that they create, like the sort of anti-tax hill in Mexico, and run for office even though they didn't want to, because they don't want to leave Mexico. They want to stay here and live out the rest of their days in the country they love. So that's that. I think we've solved investment. We just need to do the hard work of finding the specifics. I mean, this is the issue with every single conference I went to, because even if they're 3 days long, the conclusion to all these conversations is we need to get specific. And then that's where it ends. And you go back the next year and it's exactly the same conclusion. So we refuse to. We want to break the cycle. We're going to get specific, come back to the Mexico Political Economist over the course of the next year and find out who is the most promising sector in Mexico to really trigger that economic growth and development.
I'm incredibly excited to read all of this. But until then, this was Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez-Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every couple of weeks, we'll be talking about investment, politics, and everything that makes Carlos Slim tick.
Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist and follow the Plan Mexico project, amongst much more content.
Till then, toodaloo.